Thank you. Good evening. I'm Kim Knox, president of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. Thank you for joining us tonight. If anyone has a question for our speaker, please write it on one of the cards on your table, and one of our volunteers will come around to pick those up. The San Diego League is an all-volunteer organization. For anyone who would like to make a donation to support our mission, please visit the check-in desk at the end of this event, or visit our website, which is lwvsandiego.org. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Seth Hill is a professor of political science at UCSD, where he specializes in elections, political representation, and legislative politics. He is the author of the 2022 book, Frustrated Majorities, along with dozens of peer-reviewed articles in academic journals. His work, funded by organizations such as the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, has been recognized with awards, speaking engagements, media interviews, and media commentary around the country. He is an accomplished instructor and mentor at UCSD, where he teaches topics from American politics to advanced statistical methods, and supervises numerous PhD students and undergrad research projects. He is affiliated with the Halashoglu Data Science Institute, the Computational Social Sciences Program, and the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. And he serves as faculty director for the UCDC program. He received a PhD from UCLA and held a postdoctoral appointment at Yale University. I'll turn it over to you, Seth Hill.
All right. Thank you, Kim. Can everyone hear me okay?
Please use the mic.
How's that? All right. I will keep it close at hand. Thank you all for having me. It's really lovely to be here. And I am really interested to present my thoughts on the 2024 election and maybe a little bit about what's going to happen going forward. But I want to definitely leave some time for questions from you all. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I will do my best to provide some context on what happened in 2024 and what's happening at the moment in the next few weeks, in the next 4 years. All right, so here's the three things I want to talk about today. As I mentioned, what happened in 2024. So just kind of a description of the results from my perspective as someone who studies campaigns, elections, and representation. What can we know about why it happened? Why did Donald Trump win? Why did Kamala Harris not win? And then finally, what comes next, kind of with appeal to what I'm going to try to conclude on those first two questions. All right, so let's set the scene for the 2024 election. I think that the place to start is polarization. Polarization is this term that is thrown around a lot these days. And actually, there's more definitions probably than there is ability to describe things. But there's no doubt that Democrats and Republicans are more distinct, more divergent today than they used to be. My definition of polarization, which is by no means authoritative, is increasing ideological homogeneity of the party coalitions. And so by this I mean, if you went to the Republican Party in 1970 in Congress, you would see everybody from Nelson Rockefeller to Ronald Reagan type Republicans. So moderately liberal Republicans like Rockefeller to conservatives like Reagan or Goldwater. Likewise, if you go to the Democratic Party in 1970, you would have everyone from a liberal like Gene McCarthy to conservatives, even George Wallace type conservatives from the South. That is not something you would find if you go to the Congress today. There are still differences within the parties with respect to ideology, but it is nothing like it was in the 1970s. And so I think when people talk about polarization, what they really mean is that Democrat and Republican as a label, as a shortcut, means a lot more with respect to what people want from government than it did in the 1960s and 1970s. Okay, so Republicans are more conservative, Democrats are more progressive. This has been a trend that's kind of accelerating, increasing, and certainly in 2024, we had two candidates that were undoubtedly conservative and undoubtedly progressive. At the same time, even though the parties are getting more and more different and distinct, presidential elections have gotten closer and closer. Okay, so the last three elections have had national vote margins of Clinton +2. She, of course, lost the electoral vote, but it won the popular vote by 2 points. Biden wins the popular vote by 4 points. Trump wins the popular vote by 1.5 points in 2024. And even earlier in the 2000s, the elections were quite close. Of course, think about the 2000 election. In Congress, the two parties are also really close in terms of competition. The House has changed hands twice in the last 6 years. The Senate has changed control 3 times in the last decade. This is strange because it's probably true that something like 90% of voters will vote a straight ticket. Most voters, because the two parties are so polarized, are very certain that one side or the other is most likely to represent them, and they're going to vote for candidates of that party up and down the ballot. Now, one thing I'd like to say is just because 90% of voters vote a straight ticket, and just because we observe the parties in Congress and at presidential elections as polarized, we should not infer that the voters themselves are polarized. In fact, in my opinion, a lot of this polarization has happened despite the voters, not because of them. All right, and I'm not the first person to make this point, but a really nice way to think about it is what a political scientist at Stanford, Morris Fiorina, calls closely versus deeply divided. And he presented the following 2 graphics. So suppose the electorate is, in elections, is split 50-50, which is essentially what we have in the United States. There's 2 different ways we might get to 50-50 election outcomes. One is a setting as in the top graph here, where the population is very deeply divided. You've got a bunch of Democrats in the electorate over here on the left, a bunch of Republicans over here on the right, and they split up the election 50-50. When you have a Democratic candidate here and a Republican candidate here, all those voters really are quite certain, other than this small number of voters here in the very middle. But you would get the very same election result if the electorate looks like this one on the bottom frame, where most voters are actually between the Democrats and the Republicans. Most voters don't look a lot like the Democrat and Republican parties, but instead are here in the middle and are either uncertain what they should do if they're right in the middle, or perhaps they're slightly left or slightly right, and they know they prefer the Democrat or the Republican, but that doesn't mean that they actually want the polarization that they get from Congress and the president. And I would suggest this is actually closer to where we are. And what we've observed is Biden takes office and passes a bunch of progressive policies, and the voters don't really like that. Trump takes office, and he's going to pass a bunch of conservative policies, and the voters don't really like that. And we're going to be back and forth in this alternation. Another thing, okay, so this slide says, election swings only tell us that there's some middle of the electorate that's mixed between the two parties. Could be the top frame, could be the bottom frame. I think it's the bottom. But the other thing to say, of course, as the League of Women Voters I'm sure knows, is there's something like 35 or 40% of the eligible electorate who doesn't vote, even in presidential elections, right? This is something like 85 million Americans. So it's hard to imagine that those 85 million Americans are super excited about the Republican or the Democratic candidate. All right? So my guess is a lot of those folks are also here in the middle, and they're just like, you know, I don't want anything to do with either of these candidates. That's my guess. Okay. Even so, the Democrat and the Republican coalitions are certainly polarized. And because of that, even these super close election results have really large policy consequences. I don't think those policy consequences are necessarily what the voters want, and I think they're probably not what the voters want, but that's what we get. It's a longer story about why the candidates might be polarized even though the voters aren't, but I'll talk about that just a little bit here. Okay, so if the voters are ambivalent, how do we make sense of these really close elections? Well, probably there's a bunch of voters who are actually ambivalent, and they're in the middle and they're trying to figure out what to do. And so one possibility is they're like, well, we brought Biden in. We kind of like some of the things he did, but some of the other things he did seemed like they were a lot more than what we were looking for. So let's go back and give the other guys a chance. But in fact, we should actually expect elections to be close, and here's why we should expect, no matter what, presidential elections in the United States to be close. In American presidential elections, there are two coalitions who are competing to win a plurality. Well, really, they're trying to win a majority of the Electoral College, but roughly speaking, if you win more votes in the national popular vote, you're likely to win the Electoral College. Both of these parties have plenty of resources, plenty of money, plenty of consultants, plenty of pollsters. And they're out there working as hard as they possibly can to win either the Electoral College or the plurality. And if they're doing so, we should expect that they will each push themselves to their maximum advantage, such that in the end we should have really close elections. Because anytime one candidate has some durable advantage, they have some policy position that's really popular and means that they're going to win 55% of voters, the other candidate's going to say, well, I'm just going to take that position, or I'm going to come up with some way to counter that position. And so I like to think of it like a tug of war, right? Anytime one side is gaining advantage on the tug of war, the other side says, oh no, we're losing, we better start pulling the other way. And so we end up with really close elections, and this is really what we should expect. All right, so that's what political science theory makes us think about with elections. But then that begs the following questions. If parties are fighting to a standstill on all the things they can control, who their candidates are, where they spend money, what kind of policy positions they talk about, what kind of ads they run, then what should determine elections? Well, what should determine elections are things beyond the candidate's control. Okay? So these are things that they can't fully control, like the state of the economy, or whether there's a foreign war that was unplanned, whether there's some scandal that arises. Okay? So somewhat counterintuitively, if the candidates are working really hard to win elections and represent voters on all the things within their control, elections will end up being determined by things that are outside of their control. All right, so this is one of the famous findings from political science. It's called economy and the vote, or there's various phrases for it. And what I've got here is what's called a scatter plot. And the scatter plot plots each election back to 1948 as one point on the plot. And on the x-axis, I've plotted annualized growth in real GDP per capita, a rough measure of how the economy is doing. Okay? In the first two quarters of the election year. So 0 means the economy has not grown from January 1st to July 1st. 5 means the economy has grown by 5% annualized. Negative 5 means the economy has shrunk. Okay? The y-axis it says the incumbent share of the major party vote. Okay, so this means take what the Democrat received in votes, take what the Republican received in votes. Whomever is the incumbent party, you calculate what percentage of those votes they received. Okay, so 50 here on the y-axis means the parties receive the exact same number of votes. So you can see here's the year 2000, remember, which was a 50-50 election. All right, and what do we see when we look at the chart? Well, we see a rough positive relationship, and that basically means that the better the economy does in the year of the election, the higher the vote share of the incumbent party. And so down here on the left, poor Jimmy Carter in 1980 had GDP declining by more than 5% in the beginning of the election year. And he wins less than 45% of the two-party vote. Up here, 1972, Richard Nixon, right? Thank you. Has the economy growing at more than 5%, and he wins with a walk-off. Ronald Reagan, 1984. LBJ, 1964. Here's Bill Clinton, 1996. Okay? So this is what the pattern looks like. And yes, presidents have some control over the economy, but they don't have dramatic control, particularly with respect to where it's going in the election year. And so what we like to think as political scientists is the president will do as much as he or she can to make sure the economy is growing, but ultimately there are things beyond his or her control that might actually be the thing that decides the election. Okay, so what was the context in 2024? Well, famously, things were not going well for the incumbent party. In fact, they went so poorly that the incumbent party decided to switch candidates in July of the election year. Strangely enough, even though I just showed you a plot that economic growth is really important, economic growth wasn't too bad in the Biden administration. 2021 was pretty good, 2022 was okay, 2023 was okay, and 2024 was okay. So actually, if we look at where the GDP number for 2024 falls, it was like 2.4%. They should have gotten above 50% of the vote on the best fit line there. They got below that. Okay, so obviously the scattered points fall off the line. So this isn't a perfectly predictive relationship, but just like Ford in 76 and Humphrey in 68, Harris in 2024 falls below where you might have predicted based on the economy. All right, so what else was going on? Well, the wrong track numbers in the polls were really bad. For whatever reason, the voters were pretty sour on the state of the nation. And I think the general consensus is that that's because of inflation, particularly in the first couple of years of the Biden administration. This is a plot of inflation where Biden takes office, and you can see inflation really takes off and continues through 2021 and 2022. Now, political scientists would have thought that voters would kind of forgive the president for that early inflation if 23 and 24 were good economically with lower inflation, which they were, but the polls did not support that. So something about the economy, the candidate, was just not consistent with the economy, the economic growth really driving things. And I think this is a little bit one of the mysteries. But the reality is, if the polls have 70% of the country, 70% of voters saying the country's on the wrong track, that's not a good situation for the incumbent party. I think the other thing, of course, to note that seems different is that Donald Trump is just unbelievably unique in his ability to attract attention. This isn't a partisan statement, but like, if we're in a world where people are on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and there's words about the attention economy, assuming like bad news is as good as good news for attention reasons, like you couldn't construct a better candidate than Donald Trump. The guy is a black hole of attention. Okay? And I'm not going to claim he's like a good attention monger. Clearly, he mostly has bad attention. But in the end, we have to admit he will have dominated more than a decade of American politics, unlike anyone probably since Ronald Reagan, right? Ronald Reagan was on the scene throughout the 70s, almost ran for office in 76, won the presidency for 2 terms, then his vice president won in 1988. And just like Reagan, even when he was out of office, Donald Trump was attracting attention. So I don't know, is this a new world where voters, because of these phones in our pockets and our divided attention, whether there's something about a candidate who can garner attention better than others? I don't know. Okay, so I think this is really the question as we go into the 2024 presidential election. What are the voters going to do? Are they going to kick out the incumbent administration that they have judged to be below what they want? Or Are they going to avoid the chaos of the president who existed beforehand? All right, so we all know the results. In 2020, Joe Biden won 51.4% of the popular vote, Donald Trump 46.9%. In 2024, Trump wins 49.8% and Harris wins 48.3%. Third party and other votes were about the same, a little less than 2%. And so it was a net 3% of the electorate who switches their votes. All right, so we talk about, this huge dramatic change. And it is true the Electoral College had a big change. But in reality, it's like 3% of the electorate net who changed their votes. And so this is kind of what I mean about the elections not really matching to the polarized parties. It's probably just not the case that there's overwhelming support for Donald Trump to implement a whole bunch of things that he said on the campaign trail. In fact, in the battleground states, it's an even smaller switch. Okay, so this is Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the 5 states that switched their votes. 6 states, I'm sorry. In 2020, Biden wins 50% of the vote in those states versus Trump's 48%. In 2024, Trump wins 50.5% to Harris's 48.2%. Exact same number of third-party votes. 1.8% of the electorate switches. Okay, so again, the electoral vote consequence of a small number of total vote switching can be big. This is a chart comparing Trump margin in 2020 on the x-axis to Trump margin in 2024 on the y-axis for the closest states. And as you can see, there's no states here in this Trump to Harris quadrant. And here are those 6 states in the Biden to Trump quadrant. All of them very close. And in fact, just a small number of votes in the blue wall states would have led to a different election outcome. One thing to observe, that was interesting is Arizona really swung quite dramatically away from Biden and Harris. And I don't have a full story for that, but one thing as we diagnose what happened in the election is it's worth saying, okay, what happened in Wisconsin versus Arizona? And what should we make about that, both with respect to Democratic Party campaign tactics, but also with respect to what voters were thinking in this election? Here is the change in Trump's share of the vote from 2020 to 2024 across the 50 states. So the y-axis here is how much better Trump did in 2024 versus 2020. Trump improved his vote share in every single state in the country. Oregon and Washington were the smallest jumps, but the largest jumps here are New York, Florida, New Jersey, Texas, and California. Okay? So, and there's a lot of talk about Hispanic voters moving against the Democrats, and I think, clearly if you looked at these states that swing so dramatically, or I wouldn't use the word dramatically, but a 5-point shift is nothing to sneeze at. You would identify a lot of states with large Hispanic populations among those that swung towards Trump. The other thing to say about this election was it really was a nationwide thing. So unlike in 2016, where Trump's gains were very much more targeted in, blue-collar, exurban, Rust Belt areas, in 2024, the swing from 2020 was pretty much nationwide. There are very few counties, and I'll show you in just a moment here, where Harris actually does better than Biden. Here are the counties with the 10 largest Republican gains in terms of total vote. And interestingly, obviously the largest counties are Democratic counties. But in Los Angeles County, for example, Biden wins 73% of the votes in 2020. Harris wins 67% of the votes in 2024. So the net change in vote margin is 650,000 votes. Better for Trump. Cook County, that's Chicago, right? 76% Biden, 71% Harris. Miami, 54% Biden, 44% Harris. Queens, 73%, 62%. Okay, so Harris is doing much worse, or Trump is doing much better. They're the same thing. In the bluest of counties. Again, you might look and say, well, there are large Hispanic populations in Houston, Phoenix, New York, Los Angeles, Miami. And so that might be what's going on here. Where did Harris do better than Biden? Very, very few places. Her best pickup here in terms of votes was she did 13,000 votes better than Biden in Henry County, Georgia. Dane County, Wisconsin, where Madison is the other sort of green light here for Harris. But you can see like the change here is very small. If we look in terms of percentage vote instead of vote counts, so this will look at much smaller counties, where does Trump pick up the most share? Well, it's again in these counties that have large Hispanic populations in Texas, New York, and California. Harris does better. I haven't been able to diagnose the pattern of the places where Harris does better, but interestingly, Colorado, Georgia, and yeah, you might say North Dakota, but look, she goes from 11.7% to 14.6%. Okay. Turnout. So another story here is that the number of votes cast in 2024 is lower than in 2020. Not a lot lower, but a little bit lower. And roughly speaking, Harris gained 6 million fewer votes in 2024 than Biden received in 2020, whereas Trump receives 3 million more votes in 2024 than he did in 2020. All right, and I think basically if this was minus 3 million instead of minus 6 million, Harris is inaugurated as president on Monday. Again, this is a pattern pretty much everywhere. This chart shows the change in the votes cast. Sorry, the light blue doesn't show up that well. From 2020 to 2024. These are Trump votes. The light blue dots are states where Trump receives more votes in 2024 than 2020. And you can see, but for a handful of states, Trump is receiving more votes in 2024 than in 2020. In contrast, in almost every state, Harris is receiving fewer votes in 2024 than Biden did in 2020. And again, these numbers aren't humongous, but it's just enough in a very closely divided electorate to swing the Electoral College from the Democrats in 2020 to the Republicans in 2024. Okay, why? Why did it happen? So I've described what did happen. Why did it happen? I want to say that it's really hard, if not impossible, to have a simple answer to this question. And there are multiple reasons for that. But here's the ultimate challenge for us. Because of the secret ballot, we can't answer really fundamental questions like how many voters voted for Biden in 2020 and Trump in 2024. Because of the secret ballot, we don't know the answer to that question. We only know on net Trump does better in 2024 than 2020. But that could be because there's a lot of more people who transitioned from Biden to Trump than transitioned from Trump to Harris. Or it could be because no one transitioned from Trump to Harris and a small number of people transitioned from Biden to Trump. So it's a really hard question to actually figure out the accounting of what happens from election to election. Another challenge is that there are far more potential explanations than we can diagnose. So I've just thrown up here a smattering of causes that I've heard suggested were the reason that Harris lost or Trump won. And you can see there's so many explanations. How in the world would we ever know which of these or what balance of these actually cause things? So inflation, jobs, abortion, immigration, taxes, debt, democracy, fascism, Ukraine, Gaza, personality, cognitive decline, billionaires, racism, sexism. All very reasonable. You could totally imagine any of these things influencing how people voted, but it's very challenging to figure out which of these things caused people to vote in which way. All right, and the other reason that I think this is a really hard question is that the reality is voters have a really challenging task. What do voters want? They want to elect politicians who will act in their interest. What tools do they have? Well, they get to vote in a couple of offices every couple of years. Okay? But those small number of tools are what they need to use to try to get politicians to act in their interest every day across a host of issues. And this is really hard. And so when we think about problems like, suppose you're a voter who really likes Trump's trade policies but thinks he's a jerk, thinks he's a horrible person to be the leader of the country. Or suppose you think Harris is actually a wonderful person to lead the country, but you think she and Biden drove the economy into the ground. It's really unclear what a voter who holds those positions is supposed to do. And if we go back to all these different potential issues, if you're a voter who doesn't match perfectly with the candidates on every issue, it's really hard to figure out which one's important, how do you judge the two candidates. All right, so there's this idealized idea of what voters are supposed to do, which is not what they actually do, which is they learn about both candidates. And look, I'm not denigrating what the League of Women Voters does, because I think it's really valuable. But what is a voter supposed to do in the ideal? They're supposed to learn where the candidates stand on every issue. Then think where they stand on every issue. And then calculate some weighted average based on the importance of the issues across all these issues to figure out which candidate is best for them. Now, I'm sure you don't need political science to tell you this, but most voters don't actually act that way. They have limited knowledges of candidate position. They have limited knowledge of their own positions. People are busy. They have other things to do. So I don't think we should denigrate them for not spending their whole lives thinking about which candidate's better, what they should do. Instead, what people do is they look for a heuristic. Okay? Because it's hard to know all these things, they're looking for some kind of shortcut, some kind of simple cue that they can use to figure out which candidate is likely to be better for them. There's lots of potential cues out there. One is political party. Okay, so if I know what political party a candidate comes from, I have a pretty good guess of where they stand on most issues. You might think of social groups, single issues, incumbency, personality, how they did in a League of Women Voters debate. So one of the cues that I'm going to use to help us understand why the economy might be so important for vote choice is what political scientists call retrospective voting. And retrospective voting is the idea that as a heuristic, what a voter does is a voter simply says, how has the incumbent candidate done? Do I feel better off now than I did 4 years ago? Is the economy growing? Do groceries cost too much? All right? And so this will be their heuristic, what they think the incumbent has or has not delivered. And if they think the incumbent has done a good job, they're going to re-elect them. And if they think the incumbent's done a bad job, they're going to vote against them. Okay? This is a really appealing heuristic for voters who don't know a lot about politics or don't want to spend a lot of time investing in knowing about politics. Because what's nice about it? You don't actually need to know what policies the incumbent has put into place. You don't even have to know what policies the challenger is advocating. You just say, did the incumbent do well enough in my judgment? In fact, you don't even need to know the challenger. You don't need to know where you stand on policies. Okay? The problem with this heuristic is that it makes election outcomes ambiguous. If there's a lot of voters who are engaged in this retrospective voting heuristic, just because a candidate wins, it does not mean that the voters or the electorate likes the policies they advocated, right? In fact, if they kick the incumbent out and they've been following this rule, they might not know anything about the challenger. Now, probably in 2024, people knew about Donald Trump, so it's not as bad as this, but it's still the case that an election result does not indicate an endorsement necessarily of even one of the policies that the winner was advocating. Okay. In contrast to a setting of idealized voters, if all the voters were idealized, super well informed, knew everything about the candidates, we would be a little more confident that an election outcome did indicate a mandate from the winner to act upon the issues that they campaigned on. But since we're pretty confident that that's not how every voter at least is acting, the mandate of a winning candidate is less clear. Okay, so what's my take on 2024? I've been hinting at it. We'll never know for sure. But what we are pretty confident in, based on the polls, is that the majority of voters didn't like Donald Trump. But majority of voters were also quite dissatisfied with the performance of the Biden administration. Their retrospective evaluations of what Joe Biden delivered were negative. And for whatever reason, Kamala Harris was not able to jettison her connection to Joe Biden. I don't know if she was unwilling or if that was a fool's errand anyway. But ultimately, it appears that the voters transferred their dissatisfaction of Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. How do I know that? Or why do I suspect that, I should say? This is from the 2024 exit polls. And they asked the voters in the exit poll, how do you feel about the way Joe Biden is handling his job as president? And those who said they strongly or somewhat approved of Joe Biden voted 96% for Kamala Harris. Those who strongly or somewhat disapproved voted 16% for Kamala Harris. Okay? Kamala Harris actually does better than Joe Biden in 2020 on this question. So in 2020, they asked the same question about Donald Trump. And among those who approved of Donald Trump, Biden wins 8% of the vote. Okay, so Harris actually wins 16% of the voters who disapprove of Joe Biden, which is actually better than what happened in 2020. Unfortunately, 60% of the voters disapproved of Joe Biden versus only 50% disapproving of Donald Trump in 2020. So even though, in some ways this suggests she ran a good campaign, it just wasn't enough to overcome the dissatisfaction. Okay, so what I say, is your opinion of Kamala Harris favorable? 47% of voters said yes. Is your opinion of Donald Trump favorable? 46% of voters said yes. These are the same voters who elected Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. Are Donald Trump's views too extreme? 54% said yes. Are Kamala Harris's views too extreme? 47% said yes. Okay? Which one of these 5 issues mattered most to you in deciding the election? Those who said the economy, 80% for Trump. Those who said immigration, 90% for Trump. Those who said state of democracy, 80% for Harris, and abortion, 74% for Harris. How severe of a hardship was inflation for your family? No hardship at all, 77% for Harris. Severe hardship, 74% for Trump. Okay? So, I think what basically happened was a net 3% of the electorate decided, perhaps in 2020 they were dissatisfied with the performance of Donald Trump, but in 2024 they were dissatisfied with the performance of Joe Biden. Okay, let me try to wrap up quickly here. I'm sure on everyone's mind is what about now? President Trump signed something like 100 executive orders. So what will he be allowed to do? So let's talk about the Constitution. It tries to set up a system of checks and balances, shared and overlapping powers. There are a lot of opportunities to block action. In order to affect change is hard. It often involves multiple branches of government. But we're moving from a situation where there's a Democratic president, Democratic Senate, Republican House in the 118th Congress to a unified 119th Congress under the Republicans. The House majority is really narrow, so a lot of this depends on how well the Republican majority in the House works together, which shall be seen. But, of course, the president does have a lot of things they can do on their own. The broadest areas are executive actions, the way the bureaucracy works, regulation, national security, foreign policy. More limited powers that require working with Congress in terms of domestic policy, taxes, spending. So this is a list I put together before Monday. What is likely without having the House on board? I said, I should have crossed this one out too, right? Tighten border security, he's done that. End the lawsuits, done that. Withdraw from Paris, done that. More drilling, done that. Suspend student debt cancellation. I don't know if he's done that yet. I'm sure that's coming. More pressure on Ukraine, less pressure on Israel, rolling back regulations. Okay, so these are all things that the president, because of the Constitution and because of the actions of Congress, has basically his own authority to act upon. Things the president needs Congress for. Mass deportation, funding and authorization, building a wall. This is my legal understanding is that to end birthright citizenship would require Congress, if not a constitutional amendment. There's an executive order that they're trying to do otherwise. Cutting the Inflation Reduction Act money, eliminating departments, changing Medicare, Social Security, or ACA, even firing civil servants, I think probably is going to require some congressional action. We can look back to 2017 to get some sense of how much of the ambition is likely to be realized. So it was true that in 2017, when Republicans had unified control, Trump reversed most of the Obama executive orders. They populated the Supreme and lower federal courts. They passed a tax act and some deregulation. But interestingly, they did not repeal the Affordable Care Act, right? 117th Congress, when Democrats are in unified control, you'll notice a pattern. Reversal of Trump executive orders, populate Supreme and lower federal courts. They did work through Congress to pass a bunch of bills, but you'll notice all these really big things did require Congress, and in fact, most required Republicans in the Senate to be on board. So what do I say? Donald Trump is undoubtedly a bull in the china shop. He's going to make changes to policy, particularly things that he can do as an executive. He will definitely say outrageous things. That's not much of a prediction. But politics does tend to equilibrate. There's this idea of thermostatic public opinion where one party sweeps into power, they overstep their mandate for the reasons I just mentioned. The public's like, that's not really what we were going for. The other party becomes more popular. And there's this thing called the midterm slump where the president's likely to lose seats at the midterm elections. And with the Republicans having a 3-seat majority in the House, it's almost sure to flip in 2026. All right, just because the president wants something doesn't mean he gets it, even with unified control. All right, so I'm going to skip to the end here so that you guys have some time for questions because we're basically out of time. So thank you very much.
So we have questions that were solicited. We have most of them in my hand. There were some quasi-duplicates. If so many voters are in the middle, why can't a moderate candidate get elected? And a similar question is, if the electorate is more centrist, what would help make bipartisan policy possible? Kind of the same question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the $64,000 question for sure. 64 billion, I suppose, since we're talking about the federal government. So there are some different theories. Why, if most of the voters would prefer more centrist candidates, do we end up with less centrist candidates? So an argument is nomination politics, which is that the set of Americans who participate in primary elections, in campaign finance, are not representative of most Americans. And this is somewhat logical in that if you know that you have extreme views, you probably believe that if you just let elections take their course, your extreme views won't get into law. And so probably the people with extreme views appreciate that the only way they'll get what they want is by engaging in extra electoral politics. So primary elections, campaign finance, volunteering for candidates. I think that's a reasonable explanation. It still doesn't quite answer the question that, in the end, wouldn't a more centrist candidate still want to get through and win the general election? A similar argument might be the type of person who gets into politics is only getting into politics because they also feel like their views would not otherwise be represented. But none of them are super satisfying to me, and I think it's a really, really interesting question to ponder.
Okay, women, at this meeting, we're 90% women? Pretty much. Hi guys, I'm so glad you're here. Does gender make a difference? In a good economy, why do women still lose? And a similar question is, how much of the close vote can be seen as a small but real anti-women or anti-minority vote? Meaning Harris was a woman and is brown.
For sure. So if I didn't have it on that big list of cards earlier, potential explanations, it certainly should be there. And I don't think it's an unreasonable observation to note that Donald Trump ran 3 times and only lost against a male opponent. So there is political science research on this, and actually the evidence there says that women candidates do better in legislative elections and less well in executive elections. Now, these aren't huge effects, and I think, these aren't experiments, they're not randomized experiments, so I'm not sure that's true. So it is possible that there is a bias among voters, particularly for executive offices like the president or governor, strong leader, something or other. But just like I said, it's very difficult to untangle specific reasons, inflation or otherwise. I think it's also really hard to say whether any specific characteristic of Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton was the reason that they lost versus Joe Biden winning. But certainly I would definitely agree that that is a potential factor to be considering.
Does our primary system contribute to the polarization of our electorate? And if so, how can that be remedied?
Yeah, so I think that there was a lot of reform of primary elections in the first 2 decades of the 2000s, including the top 2 primary in California. And these reforms have not been as dramatic as I think myself included had hoped they would be. The thought had been when primaries were closed party primaries where only registered voters of that party could participate, that much of the rest of the electorate would stay home because they're like, well, I'm not a member of that party, so I shouldn't participate. And that having top 2 primaries or open primaries or blanket primaries would invite more voters to participate, that would change things. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have done so. Turnout's not a lot higher in primaries. It seems like the parties are still sort of centrally involved in the nomination politics. So the question is really, is it the institution of primary elections that's the problem, or whether it's a problem, but that is the culprit of polarized candidates? Or is it some feature of the electorate where there's survey evidence that people who don't vote in primaries say they don't vote in primaries, not because of the rules under which they're governed, but because they say, look, I don't know a lot about it. I don't think it's really my role to be involved in who the parties decide to nominate. Okay, so if it's that latter explanation, that would explain why instituting a top 2 primary doesn't lead to some dramatic change in elections, and instead suggest educating and outreach to voters who don't feel empowered to participate in nominations might be the better action.
Misinformation. To what degree or what percent did misinformation have a role in this last election?
Yes. I don't know. That should also have been one of those cards up there. So misinformation is a tough one because think about what I was talking about with respect to heuristics, right? If voters are looking for heuristics, misinformation could be really bad if they identify a heuristic that is misinformation and base their choice on that heuristic, that misinformation heuristic. If, on the other hand, the heuristic they're looking for is party label or the price of gas or the price of eggs, then the whole misinformation thing might not actually be that relevant to their choice. And I'm sorry to say I don't know what the balance of those two factors was in the 2024 election. But certainly it would be great if we all had an agreed upon truth that served as the basis for political debate.
So he gets 2 points for that. All you basketball fans know what that means. What sources of news, be it political or cultural, do you follow or recommend for fact-checking and reliable data?
Yeah, great question. So my approach is pluralistic, which is I don't think there's a single source that we should treat as an authority, but rather we should probably look at a couple of different sources. I really like the journalism actually of the Wall Street Journal. I think that their reporters seem really excellent, and so I like to sample from a couple of different newspapers to get my knowledge. The other thing that I've taken to do, though, is going directly to primary sources. For example, on Monday, there's a lot of news about the executive orders, but I knew that I could go to the White House website and actually read the executive order myself. Now, maybe that's not what non-PhDs want to be doing, but I do think if there's ever a matter that's really important to you, going to the primary source and not letting even a media source you feel like you trust be your only source would probably be a good practice.
So thank you so much. This gentleman actually accepted this invitation before the November 5th election. And I think none of us knew what we were getting into and what he was getting into. And he knows I really appreciate him accepting the invitation. So in honor of that, we'd like to give you a little something to remember the night by.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And thank you for your support of this topic. I appreciate you being supportive of the League. As a human being, I really appreciate your attendance and attending to this topic. Thank you so much.